Good evening, everyone. I just want to let you know what the run of show is going to look like. We're going to have about 30 minutes of a conversation here, and then I'll open things up at the end for about 10 minutes of questions. If I run out of questions, I'll open it up early. So why don't we start things off with you, Mr. Zellick? And we heard Suzanne mention how you put gender on the map at the World Bank. And I think the question that some may be thinking right now is, why did he do it? And how did he do it? And what difference did it make?
Well, the real credit belongs to Myra and some of her colleagues at the bank who did the critical role of the catalytic research and drawing attention to it. But let me explain kind of the approach that I took to this. You know, you all bring our own sort of value system to this, and I guess from my own perspective, you know, based on a simple golden rule principle of treating people the way you'd like to be treated, that, you know, giving opportunity to girls and women is the fair and right thing to do. But what I found was powerful in all 188 member countries, different cultures, different societies, was a theme that I think Myra developed, which is gender equality is smart economics. I was just talking with Milan a little bit about how self-interest drives institutions, private sector groups, and others. And what I think is most powerful in this space is start out with a simple fact. How can you ignore 50% of your society? If you ignore 50% of your society, how can you possibly develop? What's interesting, and this is where I think, well, some of this research's focus is on the developing world, this is a story for the developed world too. The Swedish Finance Ministry did some work to look at Japan's economy and just did a rough cut and say, well, if women's involvement in the society in Japan was equivalent to what it was, not just in Scandinavia, but Europe as a whole, the GDP would be about 8 to 9% higher. That's a huge jump. So, you know, I think, and again, this is where this work is very important in trying to advance this story, is that, you know, we all have sort of personal experiences. I'm sure Milan has seen this, I've seen this, that are frankly very deeply moving about how different types of interventions, not necessarily big money, just sort of changing systems, one that can make a big difference. So one that we did, I recall, in Ethiopia was to change the land title forms so that there's room for two names. And all of a sudden, women became landowners along with men. Women are, as this group probably knows, but many don't, are actually the primary agriculture producers in sub-Saharan Africa. And that then opened the door to credit, to finance, a whole series of other possibilities. I saw some work done in this study about the role of rural electrification, which obviously helps everybody. But if you think about the difference it makes, particularly depending on sort of what the family and work roles are, that if you don't have to go haul the water up and you have a water pump, if you have grinding for the corn, if you have light to study by and other things, these become as earth-shaking around the world as they were with the Rural Electrification Administration in the US in the 30s. And so what I think is interesting here is what, you know, when I would go to some villages, for example, and you also, I saw, had a project with SIWA, the Self-Employed Women's Group, which is fantastic in South Asia. I remember asking some of the women and then some of the men, you know, what do your families, what do your husbands think about this? And the amazing thing is, in most societies, if somebody can bring in more income and increase the living standards, people like it, regardless of what their sex is. The other part of it is, what you see, you know, part of the development story is giving people a chance to feel empowered. And, you know, we were talking beforehand, probably the group that I found sort of most moving was to see adolescent girls, or young and adolescent girls. You know, they're now getting some chance in education, but some chance about sort of the ceiling being lifted. And sometimes it's very small things. In one Indian school I visited, they couldn't go to high school because of safety in the city in terms of walking, but if we simply helped them get some bikes, they could be able to go to the secondary school. And so I actually went and wrote Prime Minister Singh about trying to do something about this more. So I guess at one level, you see this at a time that the world is, you know, we read in the newspapers about growth here and so on and so forth. You have this tremendous opportunity Now, what this study shows, and the work we've tried to show, is, of course, no one size fits all. So what do you learn about agriculture, adolescent girls, people at different sort of income levels? And I think driving down on this, my own view is this is going to be important for general workforce development. And let me just give you one other stretch idea that didn't come into this context. What I saw in developed societies about sort of access for women in the labor force was the same types of issues that would help, frankly, a private company or the government be able to get the full value and opportunity of the women in the workforce were going to be very similar to what you had for an elderly workforce. In other words, they needed more flexibility in time when they worked from home, other things. And if you look at the demographics of this society, this is going to be something that is of interest beyond sort of gender issues. So it's trying to recognize that, and then, as Milan and I talked about, my own sense, and I see this as an executive in an organization, you know, if you've got trained, capable women, and obviously, you know, you've got women who want to take time off and have children or raise children in different ways, you want them to be able to stay in your organization. You want to get the value. They've been trained, they've been contributing. So I think the reason I feel so strongly about this is that I think this doesn't necessarily have to become a budget-busting way of having growth. It can be fair to people, it can have opportunities, and I think the deeper you dive, whether it be agricultural sector or different types of developing countries, frankly, private companies, I'm very glad ExxonMobil is supporting this, you're going to see more and more interest in this possibility. And so, in my own sense, that's what fundamentally development is about. I guess the last point I'll mention here, because I think the report has done a nice combination of this, when people start to get into this space, and I think Milan and I have both had this experience, you know, sometimes they're a little uncomfortable with it, because, you know, is it seen as a fringe issue, you know, is it politically correct, so on and so forth. And they're motivated, they may want to do the right thing, they're just uncertain, okay? And so the way to start out is to give people practical examples. What I've seen in politics or policy is you show people what works. This is quite interesting because the work we did at the bank, the work that Milan did, the work this report did, gives lots of examples of what works. So I like the kind of the idea they had, sort of the 9 proven and sort of 9 promising. But you also want to set a work for more research. And one of the things we encountered at the bank is, frankly, a lot of countries didn't have data on women or girls. They didn't even keep it. So it's a little hard to know what you're doing if you don't have the data. So I think the other part of this is how do you build on the initial work with a sort of broader research agenda? So I think this is of enormous promise. And in addition to seeing it, you know, frankly, I've noticed that if you start to have this in your frame of reference, I give a lot of public speeches, and I start to sort of work in the point about sort of women in the economy, it gives you a natural entry point into looking at things a little differently, but frankly, within a framework that, you know, whatever your political perspective, you certainly can build support for.
Ambassador Verveer, as Mr. Zelic pointed out, the need for gender equality is not something unique to the third world. And it's kind of remarkable to think that you were the first ambassador at large for global women's issues in the US government. But as the first, what are you most proud of that you achieved, and where do you feel there is urgency for movement now?
Well, thank you, Andrea, and it's good to be with you again. I thought maybe I'd be introduced as the woman who has gone around the world quoting Bob Zelic's gender equality equals smart economics, because I get instant credibility when I say that, given who said it initially. But I also would be remiss if I didn't congratulate the UN Foundation and ExxonMobil for bringing us to this place with this report. I've known both Kathy and Suzanne a long time, and they're both very rigorous people in terms of their approach to policy and investments. And so it's no surprise that with Myra's help, who came out of retirement, your retirement was basically this project. So I think we're all benefiting immensely. This is never-ending work, but I do think that we are, all of us, appreciating much more what it represents. When I was appointed, my immediate responsibility was to integrate these issues across the department. Not one-shot initiatives, not wonderful events, but how do we integrate women's considerations and perspectives in our security work, into our economics work, across all of the regions, into development. And I think the takeaway from much of that is that we began to look at this through different eyes in some ways than the traditional. Maybe they're a bit of a paradigm shift. One is that while this is absolutely fundamentally the right thing to do based on the dignity of women and what they should enjoy and their rights being protected, it is also the smart and strategic thing to do. And that statement, in terms of being buttressed on an evidentiary foundation, I think created part of the significant shift. Because if you look at just this topic we're discussing today, women's economic empowerment, and you look at the mountain of data, which is not to say that we don't need a lot more research, we do. But if you look at everything from what women in the developed world's economic participation just over the last decade has brought to growth, to economic growth, it is equivalent of what China represents. If you look at women as accelerators of small and medium-sized businesses, which is absolutely crucial, because what we know from the data is they are accelerators of growth. They are the missing middle that the World Bank talks about. You've got micro, we talked about this afternoon. You've got the big guys, but the big missing middle is small and medium-sized enterprises, and women are critical to that. If you look at just gender equality among the indicators that the World Economic Forum has put out, they do it because the bottom line is you can't get there in terms of economic competitiveness or prosperity. And I could go on, from women as consumers to the way women spend their money to the multiplication impacts. And this began to really make a difference. A difference in, certainly in policy considerations, a difference as an attention getter, a difference of finally understanding there's something here. And when I would talk to leaders, if I talked to them about women's rights, which they usually expected, their eyes would glaze over instantly. But if I talked about their self-interest, which this was about, all of a sudden I got a different receptivity. So that evidence-based foundation, I think, is really important, and that is growing, and along with it comes the research and the indicators and the evaluations and the sound policy. And we've had tremendous shifts in our development work in that category. I think secondly has been the recognition that women are on the front lines of change. To see their agency as opposed to looking at them as victims. And I had this said to me, some of you have heard this, I see some familiar faces. One night in Kabul, when a group of very energetic women started the conversation by saying, stop looking at us as victims and look at us as the leaders that we are. And they were all on the front lines of trying to change their society, as difficult as that challenge is. So understanding from the Arab awakening to what is happening in the four categories of who were looked at in this report, that is a shift. Because if you only look at women through the prism of victims, you can't really see them doing much of anything. And then the whole world of government not acting alone, but the role of collaboration and public-private partnerships. And I was so pleased that this report goes to also the role of the private sector, commissioned by the private sector, trying to make those determinations of where it fits in all of this. And I think our collective experience is that in many ways, the business community sees this not just as something that is the right thing to do, but certainly in terms of its own bottom line, the smart and strategic thing to do. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what business is about. But as partners, it makes a huge difference. And you can see among companies like ExxonMobil, Walmart, Coca-Cola, Goldman Sachs, there's just a large number of corporations today that I almost hesitate to name one. This shift from CSR, which I do think is more of the past than the future, to really seeing these issues as part of their brand and what they are about. So that when you name a brand, you also think positively about this investment. And this works in various ways. You know, when we were developing Feed the Future, which was how to grow agricultural productivity, I remember very early those conversations in the discussion, which finally there was a recognition who produces almost half of the food around the world. It's smallhold farmers who are women. And if their participation wasn't on the table, how would we begin to address the productivity issue in a way that made all the difference? And then you look at the resources that are not equitable, certainly land rights, which are absolutely fundamental, and we had reinforced in this report. You can't get from here to there. And then when the Food and Agriculture Organization a couple of years ago put out their major annual report, it was how vital women are to the agriculture sector, in which they showed, in terms of their calculus, that you would get a 2.5 to 4% growth in the aggregate, which equaled, in their calculus, feeding another 100 to 150 million people if only women were resourced as farmers to do the kind of more productive work. Not that they're lazy, but because they don't have the access to the resources. So all of this, in a long way of getting there, I think has grown a recognition that this is something that for our own effectiveness, whether we sit in the World Bank, we sit in the State Department, at AID, or in any number of businesses today, that this really is a smart investment.
So in getting from here to there, when you're sitting across the table from a world leader, from a foreign minister, from a finance minister, and you're talking about the economic sense of all of this, that how can you ignore 50% of your population, and this is going to make you money. Is that enough to overcome often what are the cultural and traditional ways that countries function? How do you cut the cord there?
Well, it's not enough. You have to do a lot more than that. There's persuasion of leaders, and then we talked in the earlier two panels about the cultural impediments and obstacles and what they represent. So it requires any number of ways of attacking those deeply entrenched practices that are also part of the problem, not just political will. Political will is an issue that has to be dealt with as well. But I think in terms of the cultural issues, there are any number of ways that sound policy has gone at them, where if we're looking at impacts and we want to replicate the good outcomes, we can see it, for example, in assets to families to keep their daughters in school in cultures which don't see the benefit of sending their daughters to school. I remember seeing firsthand any number of programs where that asset was a cow, for example, going to the family. Now it seems like, maybe not the greatest incentive to send your daughter to school when nobody does, and the norm has been just the opposite. But in this case, it made a huge difference for the family. And so many times that same family wants to marry their daughter off very early. And I remember being in a village where I heard about the discussion going on between a father and his daughter about how she was going to get married. And she was, a young teenager. And she said no, she wanted to finish school, and they went back and forth. And finally she said, well, then I'm taking the cow with me. And he said, no, the cow belongs to the family. And she said, no, it was in my name. And he said, well, in that case, you can't get married. So, I mean, you have to, it ranges from the kind of work that goes on deeply in communities to move the norm from FGM being the greatest practice that allows a woman to benefit from all of the possibilities that that village allows, to shifting the norm to her health being what matters and ending FGM. So there's a whole variety of things that have to be done to deal with these cultural impediments. I remember being with some company representatives who were having women go door to door selling their products, only to find out that the reaction was both hostile from their husbands as well from other men who didn't see the properness of women doing this, even though it meant income to the family. But when the husband became part of that selling team, it changed dramatically, both in terms of their income and the acceptability. So this is something we're all working at every day, which is how to really deal with these deeply entrenched cultural practices. And I just had a conversation a couple of days ago with women who've gone through the Arab awakening who are desperate for ways, as the pushback is coming increasingly, for them to make those best arguments, usually in their traditional religious context, that will help them demonstrate that it's consistent with their value systems. So there's much that needs to be done in this space, and we need a lot more research here, too.
Let me just add to this. I think the way I connected to what Milan said is you can often, if you're talking about a finance minister or policymaker, you may pique their interest, but then they want to know sort of what works. Okay? And it's a question of what works at different levels. And so take one case, as maybe this audience knows, the research on these very successful conditional cash transfer programs like Oportunidades in Mexico and Bolsa Familia in Brazil, then we now have the data that shows if the money goes actually to the woman head of household, you get a different pattern of use with the children and the community and others. So you now have policy design that recognizes that. It gives that. And so that's sort of at a high level. Mm-hmm. Then as you start to go down, it depends on sort of each society. And in some cases, if you can point out, well, here's a gap in terms of financing, or here's a gap in terms of savings ability, here's a gap in terms of movement, that people can start to see impediments that can be removed. I think one other aspect, and it's the case of any empowerment, you can try to create the context, but then it's also a question of if you give a little space for the girls and women. And I think this report does this, the World Bank's reports tended to emphasize this. The intergenerational aspect of this is very, very important. And often just a little move. Again, with the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, I remember meeting some of the poorest Indian women. These women would go off for 5 or 6 months into hellish conditions and basically get salt. They would live underground as they did this. And as they started to see some opportunity for their daughters to get educated, they would start to make arrangements for those daughters to stay back and go to school and get some education. As the next generation gets a little bit of education, all of a sudden in the family discussions and other opportunities, it changes. If on top of that, you can add a sense that people feel that their actions make a difference. So IFC, the bank's private sector arm, worked with CEWA actually on designing some stoves and some lighting arrangements, and then helping with the credit and finance that frankly dealt with security, but they also dealt with entrepreneurship. And they also recognized that these women were the smartest ones to understand about the design of those systems. So I think, this goes from the big policy to the little policy, and ultimately, I think this is one reason why for the private sector this is particularly important. If you look at the Millennium Development Goals and girls going to school, at least primary school, the numbers have improved quite considerably. They're not necessarily there. In fact, actually, the girls' graduation is higher than the boys. I mean, and as we think about gender issues, you're going to have the other set of issues to think about, some of the effect for boys in violent societies and others. So I think some of this is going to move, it can move quite quickly if you sort of continue to give policymakers that are always busy and have too much to do a sense of, look, here's what other people have done and it's worked, and here are some options. And the concept of this report is options. So again, and if we actually come back to kind of the developed societies too, I think you're going to, as I suggested, with workforce and demographic changes, you're going to get different attitudes about this in companies as well. And that's why it's nice that this is a project that has a combination profit, nonprofit.
Could I just add one thing? I think Bob really underscored something very important in this generational piece, which is how much the mother so frequently wants her daughter to have a different life. We hear certainly that one is also paralyzed by that minimalist understanding just from her own life, and it can be very parochial. But I was talking recently to a group of factory women in Bangladesh, women you would not consider, for the most part, anything but perhaps besieged. But because they moved from the informal workforce to the formal and are now making wages that still are quite low comparatively, they're making more money than they ever made. And when asked what they're investing in, 9 out of 10 times it's in my daughter's education, which they will tell you they could never afford to pay for before. So I do think there is something in this piece. Again, if we could get more data on this, it would help us. But this mother-daughter movement, I think, is one so that her life does not mirror her mother's.
Frankly, in some of the societies, you wouldn't expect this. When the fathers have started to see their daughters go to school and they start to see what it does to them, some of them become fiercely protected. You've seen this in Afghanistan with the schools, for example.
I'd love to come back to your former job and the U.S. government and the attention and investment that the Obama administration has placed on empowering women economically in developing countries, and specifically in 2011 with the National Action Plan for Women, Peace, and Security. So often, not always, you see a connection between poverty and conflict. How do you think that act can address that connection and serve to empower women, but diffuse conflict as part of that?
I think that's a really good question because, for one thing, unlike this more significant economic piece, we still, I don't think, are even close in terms of the peace and security aspects of this issue. I think all of you know that the National Action Plan was predicated on what the Security Council of the UN did a little over a decade ago to link women to peace and security, their agency to peace and security. And it has 4 pillars to it. One, that the role of women in prevention. They're like the canaries in the coal mines. If they come up black, you know that there's worse to come. And we better pay close attention to the condition of women, or we're going to see greater instability and greater tensions coming our way. Issues with reflective of protecting women, as well as their role in active peace negotiations, but also their role in relief and recovery, in the design and development of programs. And I'm often struck of just how critical economic opportunity is, both the lack of in precipitating crises, but the lack of needing to be addressed as a conflict becomes close to resolution, if there is going to be stability and an end to conflict going forward. And more than half of the peace agreements that are signed result in being abrogated in, the first 10 years. So we're not doing too well in this category. And yet, having been at the table where we're trying to figure out what to do in major political transformations or in post-conflict settings or in transitions from conflict, the issue of women's economic participation rarely comes up. And this is a place where we do need more work. One of the things we're doing at Georgetown, the new institute that was founded there, was to create the kind of research and scholarship and data to give us what we have increasingly in the economic sector, but do not have in terms of women's roles in peace and security, and certainly in this economic space coming out of conflict, which I think needs to be certainly seriously addressed. And we've been, bringing academicians together with practitioners to really look at where those gaps are so that it can better inform our policies. So, the message to the president and issuing an executive order was we need to do our diplomatic work, our development work, and our military work differently. We need to factor in considerations of the role of women. But I think anybody here would agree we're still far removed from that place and have an awful lot of work to do. But this whole issue of women's economic participation and the lack of economic opportunity still holds so many societies back. Go to any number of countries that should be in a different place today, given, when conflicts ended. And they're still not where they need to be, or they're on the precipice of going back to where they were, which is what you see so often is recurrence of conflict. Because I think people don't see their lives as any better than when they were going through what brought them the conflict to begin with. And not too long ago, several of the officials of the IFC came in to see me because the IFC is doing much more work in this whole category of access to finance and the role of economic opportunity and economic empowerment in this space. So I think there's growing recognition here, but we have a lot of work to do.
I want to ask one more question, but I'm also mindful of the time. So let me open it up to some of you. If you have a question, please put up your hand, and if you don't, then I will ask another one. Please. 1 second, you've got a microphone that's just coming up behind you.
Sorry, Carol Peasley, formerly with USAID and CEDPA, the Center for Development and Population Activities. And a question building on what Milan was talking about with the national plans, and then both of you talking about trying to influence policymakers, the degree to which you think the global discussions on the post-2015 framework and ICPD plus 20, all of that discussion, are there more opportunities to influence the global economy on in a more than superficial way, and really to build it in a very firm way into to those documents? Thank you.
Well, I think things at that macro level can be useful in terms of raising attention and consciousness. I guess what where my focus of interest is a little bit more at the micro level of taking the experiences that we have already had in development or how some of these issues could be related to security and trying to sort of broaden the base of experience and making them more mainstream. And then continuing to have feedback loops and data so we learn more and more. So, and just to give you sort of one, again, contextual example, and since I'd had a couple tours at the State Department, I think I have a sense of what Milan is up against. You know, the danger with a topic like this is that is to make it more than a series of one-offs, but also to make it more than a check in the box, so that busy people say, oh, well, I've done the gender topic. And And this is not because people have bad intentions or purpose. They're busy. They're trying to do a lot of things, and they're sometimes constrained by the prior frameworks that they bring. So as an executive or a leader within an organization, you actually have to give some thought, given the incentive system and others, how you deal with that. So, I mean, just to give you one small example, in the World Bank, the task team leaders are often sort of the key sort of operational people. And they come with various specialties. But we try, and so the idea wasn't, well, we'll have the gender specialist, but instead we wanted to have the TTLs, the task team leaders, be more exposed to the experience of how a gender dimension, whether it be in a conditional cash transfer program or an agricultural program or in security program, had been used before and how you start to think about it. So the reason I'm going a little afield is that I've got nothing against those general goals, and the Millennium Development Goals did certain things, but I think we're now at a stage in this field that it's really a question of how you make institutions change in their behavior. And let me just share one other one with you, because I want to make sure I get this in at least, because I think it's important. Look, we've been talking primarily about this in terms of gender related to development in economics and growth. But again, you see, I've run institutions. I was U.S. Trade Representative at the World Bank. I've done some things in the private sector. So I don't see myself by any means as a specialist in this field. But I try to work across fields and think about how to interconnect them. And I'll tell you the honest-to-God truth, one of the things I tried to do at the bank was to bring more women into senior ranks, okay, and more developing country people. So when I left, of the top 50 people or so, the officers, over half were women, okay? And the reason I mention this is not to pat myself on the back, but say it takes work, because if you look at the executive ranks below that, only 35% are women, okay? Now, and the reality was, I approved all appointments, not only the vice president, but the next level director. Now, one reason I did that was because I wanted to review what people were doing in general numbers, okay, and just to keep sending the message. Now, interestingly enough, this was something for the women executives who work with me as much as the men. People follow the standard patterns. They look at the standard promotions. They look at kind of who did what before. And now and then you have to take risks to move somebody perhaps a little earlier, and that means you may have to mentor or support them. And you also have to have the flexibility, if they don't work out, to kind of be able to move them on. But the reason I stress this is I can't tell you how much time I spent trying to do this. And my point is, if you take your eye off it, it'll slip back. And so what I'm interested in this, and where this sort of work I think is kind of useful, is you want to continue to bring more accounts and stories. You want to show, as Milan said, how it's in people's self-interest. You know, so for example, again, as an executive of the organization, if you have a woman who's got high potential and she wants to take a few years off and play a role raising her children, why should you lose that person? It's in your interest to try to make sure that person comes back. But it won't just happen. So where I'm kind of interested is, how do you make institutions change to kind of fit this agenda?
You know, Carol, and I think I agree, because we're all accustomed to these anniversaries coming and going and putting out new documents, often without seeing a whole lot in terms of results. And I think as we go into 20 years since Beijing or ICPD or the upcoming evaluation of whither goeth the MDGs, we really should be looking at the spaces in which we all operate in our institutions and saying, well, what are we doing about X, Y, and Z? I'll tell you a really quick story, because I just came back from an APEC summit in Indonesia, and that was several years ago. Talk about an institutionalization. Some of the members of my staff went to one of the meetings of APEC and came back and said, you know, this is really not the real world. It's as though it's some sort of women's auxiliary that never meshes with policy and is not taken seriously in any way. And I began to ask questions about why you've got these 21 economies, some developing, some significantly developed, like the United States and China, And where was the issue of women's role in economic participation? And finally, I guess our ambassador got sick of hearing from me, and he said, well, you know, there's going to be a meeting in Tokyo. Japan had the baton at that point. He said, you can come and you can talk to the representatives of the countries and see if they will entertain putting this on the agenda. So I went over, and I was mostly talking to men. And when I finished, the first one who came up to me said, oh my goodness, you talked about growth. And I said, well, sir, what did you expect me to talk about? Clearly, he expected some sort of feminist ideological treatise of some kind. And that began to create movement that by the time the United States had the APEC presidency, this was a really serious effort. Secretary Clinton made a speech that I think is probably still one of the best in terms of the economic arguments for women's participation in the economy and what barriers need to be overcome. The leaders adopted this, and through the Russia process and now the Indonesian process, this is at a point where it's not lip service, where the economies are reporting back what they're doing. And what was so striking goes to the heart of what Bob started with, which is the discussion from the Japanese, where 3 years ago, nobody was talking about women's economic participation, which all the data has shown that if they would begin to close this gap, they would be in a different place. And today, their Prime Minister, Abe, has made women's economic participation one of the tenets of Abenomics, as they're calling it. So it takes constant effort, and it takes constant looking at where could we have these points of intersection, and what difference would it make institutionally? Because institutions have a lot of clout and power and resources. And in the end, I think that gives us the wind at our backs to really move agendas forward.
Institutions and businesses,
And
as we were saying.
And businesses.
Another question, we have time for one more. Anyone? Okay, well, I know I have 3 minutes, so I'll ask one more question. So as we were saying, right, I work for Mercy Corps, global humanitarian organization, and we are looking right and left for those private sector partners, not because we don't like working with institutional donors, but because the World Bank, the US government, the British government, the European Union have short-term grants. And you get a great project, right? And then the money runs out, and what do? And if it hasn't been embraced by the community, it ends. The only way to truly institutionalize and reach that impact, that scale, impact at scale, is by getting the companies involved. So, Melanne, what is your pitch?
Well, my pitch is not a whole lot different from what I said at the outset, which is what I think business increasingly recognizes today. This is in business's self-interest. It's about their bottom line, and it's about the social good. And you've got the coming together of those two outcomes that makes this particularly compelling. And I think increasingly you see the responsiveness of business. You see it in significant initiatives from across mobile. We talked about mobile this afternoon, where there's a tremendous gender gap. There's a growing gender gap in internet connectivity that is going to hold women back significantly. There are key issues in terms of savings and the role of financial institutions and access to finance. This is trending in the right direction. And I think it's trending in that direction because of the kinds of things that we're discussing today in this roadmap, which is the compelling data and research, and the fact that it speaks both to self-interest, bottom line, as well as social good.
Let me just supplement that by saying I start exactly where Melanne does with the self-interest, which is people have charitable impulses, good intentions, but if you really want to build these into profit or non-profit institutions, you have to focus on interests. So here are what a business person might think about. The brand and the brand reputation. new market segments. How do you look at the market? How do you have your customers? You know, you're just in the developing world as a whole, you now have about 2 billion people who earn between $3,000 and $20,000 a year. That amounts to about $12 trillion of purchasing power a year, okay? The Pew Global Institute or the Research Institute is doing work on that new middle class, and one aspect will be the gender dimensions. You know, what do the women buy? What do the women want? How does it affect their lifestyle? How does it affect their role in the home? So it's, in that sense, it's your customer and market segment. It's your workforce. And it's your future workforce, as I said, sort of given the demographics. And I think the other part of it was that I think for companies as a whole, is they try to kind of understand kind of where they want to be positioned in a changing global environment. Are you going to be on the cutting edge of these changes? Or are you going to be sort of caught behind and trying to catch up? And so you can probably disaggregate even further, but I think the challenge for business executives, and again, you know, it's often not any poor intention, it's just that people haven't thought in these terms. Once you start to open people to think into these types of categories, you're going to see, I mean, the traditional sort of innovation and entrepreneurship that you have in American capitalism take hold. And if you could get that and drive this agenda further, it helps everybody.
Well, what a wonderful way to end. Bob Zoellick, Ambassador Melanne Verveer, thank you both.